Thalia Mercer stood frozen in the crowded mall food court, her shopping bags slipping from her fingers. The world around her blurred as her eyes locked onto a lanky teenager across the room. It wasn't his face that made her heart stop. It was what he was wearing, a faded blue jacket with bright orange stripes down the sleeves. The same jacket her son Brixton had been wearing the day he vanished 15 years ago. The same jacket she had spent hours modifying herself, sewing on the patches Brixton had chosen with such care. A rocket ship on the right shoulder, a green dinosaur on the left elbow, and a jagged lightning bolt on the breast pocket. All still visible, all exactly where they should be. "Excuse me," Thalia mumbled, pushing past a family with ice cream cones. "Sorry, I need to—" She bumped into a chair, hardly feeling it. The boy was moving toward the exit now, laughing with friends, unaware of the woman pursuing him with desperate intensity. Thalia's heart hammered against her ribs. She hadn't run like this in years, but adrenaline propelled her forward. 15 years of wondering, of imagining every possible scenario, of waking up crying from dreams where Brixton came home. It all narrowed to this single moment, this blue jacket with orange stripes. "Wait!" she called out, but her voice was swallowed by the mall noise. The boy turned a corner toward the main entrance. Thalia lunged forward, reaching out to grab his shoulder. "Please, wait!" The teenager spun around, startled. Unfamiliar eyes blinked at her in confusion, deep brown instead of Brixton's bright blue. A stranger's face. "That jacket!" Thalia gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "Where did you get that jacket?" The boy took a step back, glancing at his friends with uncertainty. A thrift store? Is there a problem?" Thalia's vision blurred, with tears. "The patches," she whispered, reaching out to touch the rocket ship, her fingers trembling. "I sewed these on. This was my son's jacket." "Lady, I don't know what you're talking about," the boy said, backing away. "I bought this at Second Chances in Westlake, like 2 years ago." One of his friends tugged at his arm. "Come on, Felix. Let's go." Thalia stood there, hand still outstretched as they walked away. She could hear them whispering, see them glancing back at her. She didn't care. The world was spinning around her, 15 years collapsing into a single moment of recognition. "Ma'am, are you okay?" A security guard approached, concern on his face. "Do you need me to call someone?" Thalia shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. Without answering, she turned and rushed toward the exit, leaving her shopping bags, forgotten, on the food court floor. October 17th, 15 years earlier, had dawned bright and crisp in the small town of Pinewick. Leaves crunched under 8-year-old Brixton's sneakers as he raced down the stairs for breakfast, already wearing his favorite blue and orange jacket despite the heat of the house. "Mom, can I ride my bike to Lester's today? Please." Brixton hopped from one foot to the other beside the kitchen table, his dark hair falling across his forehead. Thalia smiled as she flipped pancakes at the stove. "Good morning to you too, sunshine. Did you brush your teeth?" "Yes, and I made my bed. Sort of." Brixton grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. "So can I go to Lester's?" From upstairs came the sound of the shower running. Darian, Thalia's husband, was getting ready for work at the lumber mill. He usually drove Brixton to school, but it was Saturday, a rare day when both parents were home. "I suppose so," Thalia said, sliding pancakes onto a plate. "But breakfast first. And you need to be home by noon for lunch with Dad." "Yes!" Brixton pumped his fist in victory. "Lester got a new video game. His dad says we can play for 1 hour only, But that's enough time to beat the first level if we work together. Thalia set the plate in front of him, adding a drizzle of maple syrup. Remember to wear your helmet and stay on the sidewalks, not the road. I know, Mom. Brixton rolled his eyes dramatically before stuffing a huge bite of pancake into his mouth. I'm not a baby. You'll always be my baby, Thalia said, ruffling his hair. Even when you're 100 years old. That's so weird. Brixton laughed, syrup glistening on his chin. 20 minutes later, Brixton was wheeling his bike out to the front porch. Thalia followed, drying her hands on a dish towel. The red bicycle had been his birthday present that summer, and he treasured it almost, as much as his blue jacket. Straight to Lester's house, Thalia reminded him. 3 blocks, no detours. I promise. Brixton adjusted his helmet, then zipped up his jacket despite the mild autumn morning. The colorful patches he'd begged her to sew on made him look like an explorer, he said. Ready for adventure. Home by noon, Thalia called, as Heppadaled down the driveway. Love you, Mom, Brixton shouted, standing up on the pedals as he picked up speed. Love you more, she replied, the same words they always exchanged. Brixton turned to wave at the corner, his smile bright in the morning sun, the orange stripes on his sleeves vivid against the clear blue sky. Then he was gone, disappearing around the bend in the road. That was the last time Thalia saw her son. By 1 o'clock, Thalia was worried. By 2, she was frantic. Darian had gone to Lester's house only to discover that Brixton had never arrived. Lester's parents hadn't been expecting him at all. Their son had been grounded that weekend for breaking a lamp while playing indoor baseball. The police were called. Neighbors formed search parties. Brixton's photo, a school picture showing his gap-toothed smile and unruly dark hair, was copied and distributed throughout Pinewick by nightfall. He wouldn't just wander off, Thalia insisted, her voice raw, from crying as she sat in her living room surrounded by officers. He promised he'd come straight home. Officer Zane Falco, a detective from the county sheriff's department, sat across from her, his notebook open. Mrs. Mercer, we're searching every inch between your home and the Turner residence. We've got K-9 units coming in from the city. We will find your son. But they didn't. Days passed. The search expanded from neighborhoods to forests, from local ponds to distant highways. Brixton's face appeared on regional news, then national. Age progression specialists created images of what he might look like as he grew older. Tips came in from across the country. A boy resembling Brixton seen at a gas station in Idaho, in a mall in Kentucky, at a baseball game in Florida. At Teeter. False alarms. The community rallied. Fundraisers were held. Blue ribbons, the color of Brixton's eyes, hung from every tree in Pinewick. Thalia and Darian appeared on television, pleading for information. Please, Thalia begged, staring into the camera, if you have our son, just let him come home. We won't ask questions. We just want him back. But as weeks turned to months, the active search dwindled. The police investigation remained open, but leads had dried up. The case went cold. Thalia and Darian's marriage crumbled under the weight of their grief. They never blamed each other aloud, but the blame lived in their silences, in the spaces, where conversation used to be. I can't stay in this house anymore, Darian finally said, 2 years after Brixton vanished. Every empty room screams his name. Thalia couldn't leave. What if he comes back and we're not here? What if he's trying to find his way home? They divorced the following year. Darian moved to a neighboring town, started therapy, and eventually remarried. He had 2 daughters now, a new life built on the ashes of the old one. Thalia remained in Pinewick, though she sold their family home and moved to a small apartment across town. She kept Brixton's room intact, moving all his things exactly as they had been. His space-themed bedspread, his collection of rocks and feathers, his books about dinosaurs and planets. She left his toothbrush in the bathroom cup, his muddy sneakers by the door. She joined support groups for parents of missing children. She volunteered to help distribute flyers for other missing kids. She checked age progression photos against faces in crowds, and every October 17th she baked a birthday cake, chocolate with blue frosting, Brixton's favorite, and added another candle. For 15 years, she had lived in a strange limbo of grief, unable to move forward, refusing to give up hope. Each morning, she woke up thinking, maybe today will be the day he comes home. Each night, she fell asleep trying to remember the exact sound of his laugh. Until today, when she saw the blue jacket with orange stripes in a crowded mall food court. Thalia's hands shook as she unlocked her apartment door. She stumbled inside, not bothering to turn on the lights, and collapsed onto the couch. Brixton's school photo smiled at her from the coffee table. Forever 8 years old, forever missing his front tooth, forever wearing the blue and orange jacket in which he disappeared. She reached for her phone and found the number she rarely called anymore but had never deleted. "Detective Falco? It's Thalia Mercer." Her voice trembled. "I saw Brixton's jacket today. Someone was wearing it. A teenage boy at the mall. He said he bought it at a thrift store in Westlake." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a weary sigh. "Thalia, you know there were thousands of those jackets sold." The department store confirmed that it had the patches, Thalia interrupted, her voice rising. "The rocket ship I sewed on when he got interested in space. The dinosaur from the museum gift shop. The lightning bolt he wanted because it looked like Harry Potter's scar. It was his jacket, Zane. I would know it anywhere." Another pause. "I'll make some calls," Falco finally said, his tone gentler now. "We can check with this thrift store, see if they keep records of donations." "Thank you," Thalia whispered. She hung up and sat in the dark, clutching the phone. Outside her window, the streetlights flickered on as dusk settled over Pinewick. From her neighbor's apartment came the sounds of dinner being prepared, a child laughing, normal life continuing. For the first time in 15 years, Thalia felt something stir inside her, besides grief. A dangerous, fragile feeling she was almost afraid to name. Hope. Thalia barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the blue jacket with orange stripes disappearing into the mall crowd. By morning, exhaustion hung on her like a heavy coat, but she couldn't stay in bed. She had a shift at the Pinewick Library that she couldn't miss, not if she wanted to keep her job. The small apartment felt especially cramped this morning. Thalia moved through her morning routine in a daze, making coffee she didn't drink, toast she couldn't eat. Her gaze kept drifting to Brixton's bedroom door, left slightly ajar as always, just in case. Inside that room, time stood still. The glow-in-the-dark stars still clung to the ceiling. Space posters covered the walls. Books about dinosaurs and planets lined the small bookshelf. His favorite stuffed bear, missing one eye, stuffing poking out from a worn seam, sat propped against the pillows, waiting. Thalia had moved everything exactly as it had been in their old house. She'd measured the distances between furniture, had recreated the exact arrangement of toys on his dresser. It wasn't healthy, her therapist had said years ago, before Thalia stopped going to therapy. It was preventing her from moving forward. But moving forward felt like leaving him behind. "I might have a lead," she whispered to the empty room. After all this time. At the library, Thalia went through the motions, checking in returned books, helping patrons find research materials, reading to a group of preschoolers for Tuesday story time. Her body was present, but her mind was back at the mall, following that blue jacket. "Earth to Thalia," said Mindy, her co-worker, waving a hand in front of her face. "You planning to scan that book today? Or should we wait till next week?" Thalia blinked down at the novel in her hands. "Sorry, I didn't sleep well." Mindy's expression softened. She was one of the few people who never seemed uncomfortable around Thalia, never treated her like she might break at any moment. "You want to talk about it?" "I saw Brixton's jacket yesterday," Thalia said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "At the Westbrook Mall. A teenager was wearing it." Mindy's eyes widened. "Oh, Thalia. It had the patches I sewed on," Thalia continued, her voice low so other library patrons wouldn't hear. "It was his jacket, Mindy. I'm sure of it." Mindy reached out, her hand warm on Thalia's arm. "Have you told Detective Falco?" "Yes. He's checking with the thrift store where the boy said he bought it." Thalia tried to swallow the lump in her throat. "I know what you're thinking. What everyone thinks whenever I see something that reminds me of him. That I'm imagining things that I need to let go." "I wasn't thinking that at all," Mindy said gently. "I was thinking how strong you are after everything." Thalia scanned the book and handed it to the waiting patron with a forced smile. When the customer walked away, she turned back to Mindy. "I've spent 15 years wondering if he's alive or dead. Wondering if he's out there somewhere looking for me. Or if he's gone." Her voice broke on the last word. "I need to know what happened to him, even if the answer breaks me." Mindy squeezed her hand. "I know. And whatever you find out, I'm here." That evening, Thalia drove to the Westbrook Mall again. She wandered through the food court, scanning faces, looking for the blue jacket. There was no sign of the teenager, called Felix, or his friends. Her phone rang as she was heading back to her car. "Detective Falco, I contacted the thrift store in Westlake," he said without preamble. "Second Chances on Oak Street." Thalia's heart leaped. "And?" "They don't keep records of who donates items," Falco said, his voice carefully neutral. "Items that don't sell within 3 months are either sent to another charity or discarded." Thalia gripped the phone tighter. "But the jacket did sell. To that boy, Felix." "Yes, but they have no way of knowing where it came from originally." A pause. "Thalia, I know this is hard to hear, but this might not lead anywhere. We've had false starts before," Thalia remembered. The phone calls saying Brixton had been spotted at a bus station in Florida. The woman who claimed she'd seen him at a summer camp in Maine. The psychic who insisted his spirit was near water. All of them had led to nothing but renewed grief. "This is different," she insisted. "I saw the jacket myself. I touched it." Falco sighed. "All right, I'll keep looking into it. But Thalia, please try not to get your hopes too high." After they hung up, Thalia sat in her car in the mall parking lot, watching families load shopping bags into their vehicles, teenagers laughing together, normal life happening all around her. She hadn't had normal in 15 years. Her phone rang again. Darian. Her ex-husband rarely called except on anniversaries, Brixton's birthday, the day he disappeared, or when a new age progression photo was released. "Darian," she answered, suddenly exhausted. "Mindy called me," he said. "She's worried about you. Said you saw—" He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. "Brixton's jacket," Thalia supplied. "Yes, on a teenager at the mall." There was a long pause. She could picture him rubbing his forehead the way he did when stressed. "Thalia," he finally said, his voice gentle in a way that made her want to scream. "We've been through this before. The jacket wasn't unique. It had the patches, Darian, the ones I sewed on myself." Another pause. "Let Detective Falco handle it. Please, I can't." His voice cracked. "I can't go through all this again, and neither can you." After Brixton vanished, Darian had plunged himself into the search. Taken leave from work, coordinated volunteers. But after a year with no answers, something had broken in him. He'd started therapy, joined a support group, and slowly began to rebuild a life without Brixton in it. Thalia never could. "I'm going to that thrift store tomorrow," she told him. "I have to follow this lead." "I know better than to try and stop you," Darian said quietly. "Just be careful." After hanging up, Thalia finally drove home where Brixton's room waited. With its door ajar, 8-year-old ghost shoes by the door, 8-year-old ghost pajamas folded on the dresser, an 8-year-old ghost who never grew up, frozen in time by her refusal to let go. For the first time in years, she stepped fully inside, sat on his bed, and held his teddy bear to her chest. Her eyes fell on the bulletin board above his desk, still covered with his drawings, spaceships and dinosaurs and stick-figure superheroes, and there, in the corner, a child's drawing of their family. A tall figure labeled Dad, a smaller one labeled Mom, and himself in the middle, wearing a blue rectangle with orange stripes. "I'm going to find out what happened to you," she whispered to the empty room. "I promise." The next morning, Thalia called in sick to the library. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her stomach churned with anxiety, and her head throbbed from another sleepless night. She couldn't focus on cataloging books or helping patrons when Brixton's jacket was out there, a thread she needed to follow. Second Chance's thrift store sat on a corner in downtown Westlake, a 30-minute drive from Pinewick, the neighboring. Town was smaller, built around a paper mill that had closed a decade ago. Many storefronts stood empty, windows papered over or boarded up. But Second Chance's looked well kept, with a fresh coat of blue paint and a hand-lettered sign in the window, announcing a half-off sale on winter coats. A bell jingled as Thalia pushed open the door. The shop smelled like mothballs and fabric softener. Racks of clothing filled the main floor, while shelves along the walls held books, toys, and household items. A gray-haired woman sat behind the counter, reading a paperback with a well-creased spine. "Good morning," the woman said, looking up with a smile. "Let me know if you need help finding anything." Thalia approached the counter, clutching her purse strap. "Actually, I'm hoping you can help me with some information. My name is Thalia Mercer." The woman's smile remained, but her eyes grew wary. "I'm Doris. What kind of information?" "A teenage boy bought a jacket here about 2 years ago. Blue, with orange stripes, with patches sewn onto it." Thalia pulled out her phone and showed Doris an old photo of Brixton wearing the jacket. "This jacket," Doris squinted at the screen. "I'm sorry, dear, but we get hundreds of items through, here every month. I couldn't possibly remember one specific jacket from 2 years ago." "The boy's name is Felix," Thalia pressed. "He comes to Westbrook Mall with his friends. He told me he bought the jacket here." "Felix Landry?" Doris's expression cleared. "Tall boy. Always wears those big headphones?" Thalia's heart raced. "Yes, that could be him." "Do you remember the jacket?" Doris frowned, thinking. "Maybe. We don't keep records of purchases unless they're over $50. And we certainly don't track where donations come from." She paused. "Is that boy in trouble?" "Felix is a good kid." "No, he's not in trouble," Thalia assured her. "The jacket belonged to my son. It has sentimental value. Understanding dawned on Doris's face. Oh, well, I'm sure if you offered to buy it back. My son has been missing for 15 years, Thalia blurted out. He was wearing that jacket when he disappeared. Doris's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my goodness. You're that mother? From Pinewick? I remember the news stories. Thalia nodded, throat tight. Even after all this time, being recognized as that mother stung. I'm so sorry, Doris said, reaching across the counter to touch Thalia's hand. Let me think. We do have a donation log, with names and dates, but not item specifics. Would that help? Yes, please. Anything. Doris disappeared into a back room and returned with a thick binder. This covers the last 3 years, she said, flipping through pages. If the jacket came in about 2 years ago, and if Felix bought it soon after. They spent an hour going through names and dates. Doris explained that most donations came from regular contributors, church members, teachers, a few wealthy families, who did seasonal closet cleanouts. Some came from estate sales when elderly residents passed away. We also get items from the lost and found at the community center, Doris said, pointing to monthly entries. If things aren't claimed after 6 months, they send them here. Thalia latched onto this. The community center? Where's that? Just down on Maple Street. Big brick building. They have an indoor pool, gym, senior activities, lots of kids' programs. 2. A glimmer of possibility sparked in Thalia's mind. If Brixton's jacket had somehow ended up in that lost and found, she thanked Doris and headed straight to the Westlake Community Center. The building was, as Doris described, a large brick structure with banners announcing summer swim lessons and senior bingo nights. Inside, a teenager with braces manned the front desk, looking bored as she scrolled through her phone. Hi, Thalia said, forcing brightness into her voice. I'm wondering about your lost and found policies. The girl barely looked up. If you lost something, check the bin by the door. If it's not there, it's gone. Thalia spotted a plastic container labeled Lost and Found near the entrance, half filled with water bottles, single gloves, and a child's sneaker. Actually, I'm wondering about items that aren't claimed. I heard they go to Second Chance's thrift store? This got the girl's attention. Yeah, every 6 months. My mom runs this place. Want me to get her? Minutes later, Thalia was sitting in a small office with Marion Keller, the center's director. Marion was a brisk woman with short salt and pepper, hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. We don't keep records of lost and found items, Marion explained after hearing Thalia's story. But I've been director here for 20 years. I would have noticed a child's jacket with those distinctive patches. Thalia's hope deflated. I understand. I just thought. Have you asked at the schools? Marion suggested. Middle and high. School lost and found boxes are always overflowing. Kids leave things everywhere. This sparked another possibility. Thalia spent the rest of the day visiting every school in Westlake. 2 elementary schools, 1 middle school, and a high school. None of their lost and found records or memories stretched back far enough to be helpful. By late afternoon, Thalia was sitting in her car, exhausted, and no closer to answers. She stared at her phone, debating whether to call Detective Falco. He'd warned her not to get her hopes up. Maybe he was right. Instead, she drove back to Westbrook Mall. She'd spend the evening there again, watching for Felix and his distinctive jacket. For 3 evenings in a row, Thalia haunted the mall food court after work. She bought coffees she didn't drink, pretended to read books she couldn't focus on, and watched every teenager who entered. No sign of Felix. On the fourth evening, as she was about to give up, the mall security guard who had approached her that first day stopped at her table. "Still looking for that kid?" he asked kindly. Thalia nodded, embarrassed to be so transparent. "His name is Felix. I think he goes to Westlake High." The guard, his name tag read Walter, sat down across from her. "The tall kid with the blue jacket? Headphones always on?" Thalia's heart jumped. "Yes. Have you seen him?" "Those Westlake kids come on Tuesdays mostly," Walter said. "That's when the arcade runs half-price games. Today's Friday." "Tuesdays," Thalia repeated, a new plan forming. "Thank you, Walter." The following Tuesday, Thalia took another sick day from the library. She positioned herself near the mall entrance at 3 o'clock, when school let out. By 4:30, she was beginning to lose hope. Then she saw them. A group of teenagers pushing through the doors, laughing and shoving each other playfully. Among them was a lanky boy with headphones around his neck, wearing a blue jacket with orange stripes. Felix. Thalia stood frozen for a moment, afraid he would bolt if she approached too aggressively. She watched as the group headed toward the arcade, then followed at a distance. Her stomach knotted with nerves. What would she say to him? How could she explain why this mattered so much without seeming unhinged? The arcade was dim and noisy, filled with flashing lights and electronic beeps. Thalia spotted Felix at a racing game, headphones now on, fingers flying over the controls. She approached slowly and stood nearby until the game ended. When Felix looked up and saw her, his eyes widened in recognition. "You're the jacket lady," he said, slipping his headphones off. "From last week," Thalia nodded, trying to smile. "I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to scare you. My name is Thalia Mercer." Felix glanced at his friends, who were watching curiously from a zombie shooting game nearby. "It's cool. You said this was your son's jacket?" "Yes." Thalia's voice shook slightly. "I need to know where you got it. Exactly. It's very important." Felix shrugged. "Like I said, second chances in Westlake. My mom makes me shop there." He lowered his voice, seeming embarrassed. "We don't have a lot of money." "Do you remember when?" "Exactly when?" The boy frowned, thinking, "Maybe 2 years ago? I liked the patches, especially the rocket ship." He touched the patch on his shoulder. "I'm into space stuff, too." Just like Brixton had been. Thalia swallowed hard. "Felix," she said carefully, "my son disappeared 15 years ago, wearing this jacket. If I could just—" "Wait!" Felix's eyes widened. "Is this about that missing kid? The one on those posters in the post office?" Recognition dawned on his face. "Oh, man. This is that jacket?" Thalia felt like she couldn't breathe. "You've seen his posters?" "Yeah, in the post office. My mom makes me mail her bills." Felix's expression shifted from surprise to discomfort. "I didn't know. I never would have bought it if—" "It's not your fault," Thalia said quickly. "You couldn't have known." Felix's friends had wandered over, curious about the conversation. A girl with purple-streaked hair put her hand on Felix's arm. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Felix said, but his voice was uncertain. "This lady, her son was the kid from those missing posters, and this is his jacket." The other teenagers stared at Thalia with a mixture of curiosity and unease. One boy whispered something that sounded like creepy, but the girl with purple hair elbowed him sharply. "Can we talk somewhere quieter?" Thalia asked Felix. He hesitated, then nodded. "I guess. Food court?" They found a table in a far corner. of the food court. Felix's friends, after some whispered discussion, left them alone but watched from a table nearby. Thalia didn't blame them for being cautious. She was a stranger, after all. Up close, Felix looked nothing like what Brixton might have grown into. His hair was sandy blonde, his eyes hazel, his nose long and narrow. But seeing him in Brixton's jacket made Thalia's chest ache with a peculiar mixture of grief and hope. "I've been searching for answers for 15 years, Thalia began. "My son, Brixton, was 8 when he disappeared. He was riding his bike to a friend's house, wearing this jacket. He never arrived." Felix fidgeted with his headphone cord. "That's rough. I'm sorry." The police searched everywhere. There were no witnesses, no evidence. It was like he vanished into thin air. Thalia swallowed hard. Seeing his jacket after all this time, I need to know where it came from. How it ended up at that thrift store. Felix frowned, thinking, I bought it maybe 2 summers ago, right before freshman year started. He tugged at the jacket sleeve. I liked that it was different, with the patches and stuff. Most things at second chances are pretty basic. Do you remember anything else about when you bought it? Was it with a certain batch of clothes? Did you speak to anyone about it? There was an old lady working when I bought it. Not Doris. Someone else. Felix's brow furrowed with concentration. She said something about it just coming in that week. From a church donation, I think? Or maybe a community drive? It wasn't much to go on, but it was more than Thalia had before. Felix, I know this is strange, but would you be willing to sell me the jacket? Thalia asked, her voice catching. I'll pay whatever you want. The boy looked startled. I don't need your money. He glanced down at the jacket, then back at Thalia's face. You can just have it. It belongs to your son anyway. Before Thalia could respond, Felix was already unzipping the jacket. He slipped it off and held it out to her. Here. Thalia reached for it with trembling hands. The fabric was more worn than when she'd last seen it on Brixton. The blue faded to a softer shade. The orange stripes dulled with time and washings. But the patches she'd sewn on were still there. The rocket ship on the right shoulder, the dinosaur on the left elbow, the lightning bolt on the breast pocket. Thank you, she whispered, clutching it to her chest. This means more than you can imagine. Felix shifted uncomfortably. No problem. I hope it helps you find out what happened to your son. Thalia ran her fingers over the patches, remembering how Brixton had picked each one out, how delighted he'd been when she'd finished sewing them on. She turned the jacket inside out, examining the lining, the pockets, looking for any clue, any hint of where it had been all these years. Her fingers found a small tear in the inner lining, a tear she remembered mending once when Brixton had caught it on a fence. Her repair was still there, small, uneven stitches in blue thread. This was undeniably his jacket. As she checked the pockets, her fingers brushed against something in the inside breast pocket. She reached in and pulled out a small, stiff rectangle. A business card, faded and worn around the edges, but still legible. Merrick's Auto Repair Complete Service and Restoration Lakeside District, Oakston 55555, 72113 Thalia, stared at the card. Oakston was a city about 90 miles north of Pinewick. She'd never been there. Brixton had never been there, as far as she knew. Did you put this in the pocket? She asked Felix, showing him the card. He shook his head. Never seen it before. The pockets were empty when I bought it. Or at least, I thought they were. Thalia turned the card over. There was nothing written on the back. Just a standard business card for an auto repair shop in a city where she had no connections. I should go, Felix said, glancing at his friends who were still watching curiously. My mom's picking us up at 6. Of course. Thalia tucked the card back into the jacket pocket and stood up. Thank you for the jacket, Felix. You've done more for me today than you can possibly understand. The boy nodded, looking relieved that the strange encounter was ending. Hope you find some answers, he said awkwardly. As Felix walked away to rejoin his friends, Thalia remained at the table, staring down at the jacket in her hands. After 15 years of dead ends, she was holding a tangible piece of her son again. And not just the jacket, but a new clue, a business card from a city she'd never visited. She pulled out her phone and dialed Detective Falco. I have Brixton's jacket, she said when he answered. The actual jacket, with the patches I sewed on. And there was a business card in the pocket for an auto repair shop in Oakston. Thalia, Falco said, his voice cautious. That's interesting. But it's his jacket, Zane. I found the tear I mended in the lining. It's definitely his. A long silence, then a sigh. Where did the boy get it? Second Chance's thrift store in Westlake. It might have come from a church donation. Thalia's words tumbled out in a rush. I'm going to call this auto shop. Maybe someone there knows something. Let me handle that, Falco said quickly. What's the name of the business? Merrick's Auto Repair. It's in the lakeside district of Oakston. I'll check it out and call you back. Falco's tone softened. This is the first real lead we've had in years, Thalia. Let's do this right. After hanging up, Thalia remained at the food court table clutching the jacket. She buried her face in the fabric, breathing deeply, searching for any lingering trace of her son's scent. But there was only the smell of detergent and the faint musk of teenage boy. Felix, not Brixton. Still, she had the jacket and the card. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't just hoping blindly. She was following a trail. Thalia couldn't wait for Detective Falco to call her back. Sitting in her car in the mall parking lot, she pulled out her phone and searched for Merrick's Auto Repair Oakston. The search returned nothing current, just an old listing showing the business as permanently closed. She tried calling the number on the card anyway. A robotic voice informed her that the number had been disconnected. Another dead end. But she refused to give up. Not with Brixton's jacket finally back in her possession. Not with the first real clue in 15 years. When she got home, Thalia laid the jacket carefully on her kitchen table and examined it inch by inch under bright light. She checked every seam, every pocket, looking for any other clues besides the business card. In the front pocket, she found lint, an old cough drop still in its wrapper, and a penny dated 7 years after Brixton's disappearance. The penny meant the jacket had remained in circulation, been worn or stored somewhere all these years. But where? And by whom? Her phone rang. Detective Falco. The business closed 5 years ago, he said without preamble. Ownership records show it belonged to a Tolan Merrick from 1979 until 2020, when he retired and closed shop. Do you have an address for him? Maybe he knows something. I'm working on it. His last known address was the apartment above the repair shop, but property records show it sold 3 years ago to a development company. Falco paused. Thalia, I need to ask, are you absolutely certain this is Brixton's jacket? Not just a similar one? I found my own mending on the inside lining, she said firmly. It's his, I'm sure of it. All right, I'll keep digging into Tolan, Merrick and the repair shop. I've also put in a request to Oakston PD to check if they ever had any cases involving Brixton. Thank you, Zane, Thalia said, relieved that he was taking this seriously. After hanging up, she sat staring at the jacket, willing it to reveal its secrets. How had it traveled from Pinewick to Oakston, and then to a thrift store in Westlake? Who had worn it after Brixton? And most importantly, what had happened to her son. A knock at her door startled her. Her sister Ivy stood on the doorstep, holding a paper bag that smelled like Chinese food. "Mindy called me," Ivy said, brushing past Thalia into the apartment. "Said you found Brixton's jacket?" Thalia sighed. The Pinewick grapevine was working, over time. "Yes, a teenager at the mall was wearing it." Ivy stopped short when she saw the jacket laid out on the kitchen table. "Oh my God, it really is his." She reached out to touch one of the patches, the dinosaur she had helped Brixton pick out at the museum gift shop. "I can't believe it." "There was a business card in the pocket," Thalia said, showing her sister. "For an auto shop in Oakston. Detective Falco is looking into it." Ivy's expression shifted from wonder to concern. "Thalia, you know finding his jacket doesn't necessarily mean that we'll find him." "I know." Thalia folded the jacket carefully. "But it's the first real lead in 15 years. I have to follow it." Ivy set the food on the counter and turned to face her sister fully. "Are you seeing Dr. Linden again?" Thalia bristled. "I don't need therapy, Ivy. I need answers." "You need both," Ivy insisted gently. "This is going to bring up a lot of emotions, whether you find answers or not. Dr. Linden helped you before." Dr. Linden had been Thalia's therapist for 3 years after Brixton's disappearance. She'd been kind, compassionate, and utterly unable to help Thalia move forward without knowing what had happened to her son. "I'll think about it," Thalia said, knowing she wouldn't. "Right now, I need to focus on this lead." They ate dinner together, talking about Ivy's kids, her husband's new job, normal family things that felt like they were happening in another dimension. Thalia nodded and smiled in the right places, but her mind kept circling back to the business card. Merrick's Auto. Repair. Oakston. A connection she couldn't yet understand. After Ivy left, Thalia sat at her computer and searched for any information about Oakston, the Lakeside District, and Merrick's Auto Repair. She found old business listings, a few reviews from years ago complaining about prices, nothing useful. The repair shop had maintained a low online profile. She tried searching for Tolan Merrick next, and found an obituary for a Catherine Merrick from 8 years ago, listing Tolan as her surviving husband. The funeral had been held at First Baptist Church in Oakston. It wasn't much, but it was another thread to pull. On impulse, Thalia posted about her discovery in several missing children forums and social media groups she'd joined over the years. She described finding the jacket, the business card, asked if anyone had connections to Oakston or knew anything about Merrick's Auto Repair. Late that night, as she was finally getting ready for bed, her phone pinged with a message. It was from a woman named Geneva Porter, responding to her post. "I used to live in Oakston and got my car serviced at Merrick's for years. The owner's nephew worked there, odd guy, but he was kind to me once. Would love to talk more if it might. Help!" Thalia's hands trembled as she typed a reply, asking to meet. Geneva responded immediately, suggesting coffee the next day. She lived in Cedar Grove now, just a 30-minute drive from Pinewick. For the first time since finding the jacket, Thalia slept soundly, Brixton's blue and orange jacket folded carefully on the pillow beside her. The trail hadn't gone cold after all. It was just beginning. Thalia arrived at the Cedar Grove Coffee House 20 minutes early. She chose a table in the corner with a clear view of the door and ordered a black coffee she knew she wouldn't drink. Her stomach was too knotted with anticipation. She had brought the jacket with her, folded carefully in a tote bag. She couldn't bear to let it out of her sight now that she had it back. Brixton's jacket, the only piece of him that had returned to her in 15 years. At exactly 10 o'clock, a woman in her early 60s walked through the door. She had shoulder-length silver hair, wore jeans and a purple sweater, and carried herself with the straight-backed posture of someone who refused to let age slow her down. Her eyes scanned the coffee shop until they landed on Thalia. "Geneva?" Thalia asked as the woman approached her table. "You must be Thalia." Geneva's handshake was firm. "I recognized you from your profile picture." She settled into the chair across from Thalia. "I ordered your post about 4 times before responding. It's not every day you see someone looking for information about an old auto shop in Oakston." The server came by, and Geneva ordered a chai latte. When they were alone again, Thalia pulled out the business card and placed it on the table between them. "This was in the pocket of my son's jacket," she explained. "The jacket he was wearing when he disappeared 15 years ago." Geneva studied the card, her expression somber. "Merrick's. I went there for years until Tolan retired. Good mechanic. Fair prices." "Did you ever see a young boy there?" Thalia asked, her voice catching. "Or hear anything about a missing child?" Geneva's eyes softened with sympathy. "No, nothing like that. I'm sorry." Thalia pulled out her phone and showed Geneva a photo of Brixton, the school picture taken 2 months before he disappeared. His gap-toothed smile, the cowlick in his dark hair that never would stay down, his bright blue eyes. "His name is Brixton. He was 8 years old." Geneva studied the photo and shook her head. "I've never seen him. I wish I could tell you otherwise." Disappointment washed over Thalia. She had hoped for an immediate recognition, a clear connection. "In your message, you mentioned the owner's nephew?" "Cassius Reed." Geneva nodded, her expression changing. "Tolan's sister's boy. He worked at the shop off and on for years. He was different." "Different how?" "He had some kind of developmental disorder. Never diagnosed properly, from what I gathered. Brilliant with engines but struggled with people." Geneva wrapped her hands around her mug. "Folks in town called him strange, but he wasn't dangerous. Just socially awkward. Lived in his own world." "Why did you mention him specifically?" Geneva's eyes took on a faraway look. "About 6 years ago, my car broke down on the highway. Middle of winter, freezing cold. Cassius was the one who came with the tow truck. When we got back to the shop, Tolan said the repair would cost over $800, money I didn't have back then. I was recently divorced, barely making ends meet." She paused as the server brought her drink. "I started crying right there in the shop," Geneva continued. "Couldn't help it. Cassius was in the corner, working on another car. Didn't seem to be paying attention. But after Tolan went to his office, Cassius came over and said he could fix my car for free if I brought him lunch for a week." Thalia leaned forward. "He helped you?" "Fixed it good as new. Brought him soup and sandwiches for 7 days straight." Geneva smiled at the memory. "After that, I always asked for him when my car needed work. He never chatted like other mechanics, never tried to upsell me on services I didn't need. Just fixed what was broken." Thalia tried to connect this information to her son's jacket. Did he have any connection to Pinwick? Or children? Geneva frowned. "Not that I know of. He lived above the repair shop. Didn't drive much, despite working with cars all day. Preferred to walk or ride his bicycle." A bicycle. Thalia's pulse quickened. "Did he collect things? Objects he found?" "Now that you mention it, yes." Geneva looked surprised. "His apartment was full of things he'd salvaged. I dropped by once to bring him Christmas cookies. Tolan let me up. Cassius had shelves and shelves of stuff he'd found. Broken electronics he'd repaired. Toys, all sorts of odds and ends. He was big on rescuing things others had thrown away." Thalia's mind raced. A man who collected discarded items, who rode a bicycle, who worked at the auto shop whose card was in Brixton's pocket. It was a connection, however tenuous. "Do you know where Cassius is now?" Geneva shook her head. "He left Oakston after Tolan retired. No one seemed to know where he went. He wasn't the type to keep in touch." "Was there anyone he was close to? Anyone who might know where he is?" Geneva thought for a moment. "Just one person, maybe. A woman named Zinnia Moss. She worked at the plant nursery across from the auto shop. They seemed friendly. She was one of the few people who took the time to understand him." Thalia pulled out a notepad and wrote down the name. "Zinnia Moss. Do you know if she's still in Oakston?" "Last I heard, she owns the nursery now." For the next hour, Thalia asked Geneva everything she could remember about Cassius Reed and Merrick's auto repair. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that this was a lead worth following. A man who collected discarded items might have found Brixton's jacket somewhere. If she could find Cassius, maybe he could tell her where he'd found it. As they were saying goodbye, Geneva touched Thalia's arm. "I hope you find what you're looking for. But be careful with Cassius if you track him down. He's not dangerous, but he can be easily overwhelmed. And after all this time—" She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. "Don't expect miracles." "Thank you for meeting me," Thalia said sincerely. "You've given me the first real lead I've had in 15 years. On the drive home, Thalia called Detective Falco and updated him on everything Geneva had told her about Cassius Reed. "I'm heading to Oakston tomorrow," she said. "I need to find this Zinnia Moss." "Thalia," Falco's voice was cautious. "Let me make some calls first. We need to verify this Cassius Reed. Check if he has any criminal history." "I'll be careful," she promised. "But I'm not waiting anymore. I'm going to Oakston tomorrow, with or without you." That night, Thalia searched online for Zinnia Moss Plant Nursery, Oakston, and found it. Lakeside Gardens, located on the same street as the now-closed auto repair shop. According to the website, they specialized in native plants and were open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tomorrow was Tuesday. Thalia packed a small overnight bag, just in case. For the first time in 15 years, she felt like she was moving forward instead of standing still, trapped in the moment of Brixton's disappearance. The jacket lay on her dresser, a silent witness to wherever it had been all these years. "We're getting closer," she whispered to it, to Brixton, to herself. "I can feel it." Thalia woke before her alarm, dreams of Brixton still fresh in her mind. In the dream, he had been riding his bike down an endless road, always just around the Aoi next corner, always just out of reach. She dressed quickly, packed Brixton's jacket carefully in her tote bag, and was on the road by 6. The 90-mile drive to Oakston gave her too much time to think, to hope, to fear. Her phone rang halfway there. Detective Falco. "I've done some digging on Cassius Reed," he said without preamble. 39 years old, several minor arrests over the years, trespassing, petty theft, nothing violent. Last known address was the apartment above Merrick's Auto. No driver's license, no current employment records. What about Zinnia Moss? Clean record. Owns Lakeside Gardens Nursery for the past 5 years. Previously worked there for 12 years, under the former owner. "I'm heading there now," Thalia said. "I need to talk to her." Falco sighed. "I figured you would. I've cleared my schedule. I'll meet you in Oakston by noon." Thalia was surprised. "You're coming?" "This is the first solid lead on Brixton's case in 15 years. I'm not letting you follow it alone." Relief washed over her. Despite her determination, The thought of facing this alone had been daunting. "Thank you, Zane. Just don't do anything until I get there, okay?" Thalia agreed, but as she drove into Oakston 3 hours later, she knew she wouldn't wait. 15 years had been waiting enough. Oakston was larger than Pinewick, built along the shore of Lake Merrill. The downtown area was a mix of old brick buildings and newer developments. Thalia followed her GPS to the Lakeside District, a once industrial area being slowly transformed by coffee shops and boutiques. Merrick's Auto Repair was easy to spot, a faded blue building with peeling paint and a weathered sign. The windows were covered with brown paper, and a "For Lease" sign hung crookedly on the door. Across the street sat Lakeside Gardens, a vibrant contrast with its colorful flower displays and neat green awning. Thalia parked in front of the auto shop and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. This building was connected to her son's jacket. It might hold answers she'd been seeking for 15 years. Against her promise to Falco, she got out of her car and approached the old repair shop. Most of the windows were too dirty to see through, but she cupped her hands against the glass of the front door, peering inside. She could make out the shadowy shapes of old equipment, workbenches, a forgotten calendar still hanging on the wall. She tried the front door. Locked, as expected. But as she walked around to the back of the building, she found a rear entrance with a broken padlock hanging uselessly from the hasp. Her heart raced as she hesitated at the door. This was trespassing. But if there was any chance of finding information about Brixton, the door creaked as she pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that streamed through the dirty windows. The shop was frozen in time. Tools still hung on pegboards, an invoice still pinned to a corkboard, coffee mugs still on a shelf above a small kitchenette. Thalia moved slowly through the space, trying to imagine Cassius Reed working here. According to Geneva, he had lived upstairs. She found a narrow staircase at the back of the shop and climbed it cautiously, testing each step. The door at the top was unlocked. She pushed it open to reveal a small apartment. 1 bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchenette, and a living area. Unlike the shop below, the apartment had been mostly cleared out. No furniture remained except for a metal folding chair in the corner and a mattress on the floor in the bedroom. But the closet door was ajar, and inside, Thalia found a cardboard box that had been left behind. Her hands trembled as she lifted it and carried it to the window for better light. Inside were odds and ends, old auto magazines, socket wrenches, a flashlight with no batteries. At the bottom of the box was a battered photo album with a faux leather cover. Thalia opened it, her breath catching. Most of the photos were of cars, before and after repair shots, proud customers standing next to their vehicles. A few showed an older man, presumably Tolan Merrick, and occasionally a younger man with downcast eyes who never looked directly at the camera. Cassius, she guessed. She flipped through slowly, looking for any sign of Brixton, any clue to what might have happened to him. Nothing, until the last page. There, stuck in the back of the album, was a photo of a teenager standing beside a restored vintage Mustang. The boy was grinning proudly, hand resting on the car's hood. But it wasn't the boy or the car that made Thalia's blood run cold. It was what was visible in the background, partially cut off at the edge of the image. A child's bicycle, red with silver handlebars, propped against the wall of the garage. Bicycle that looked exactly like the one Brixton had been riding the day he disappeared. Thalia's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the album. She took a photo of the image with her phone, then carefully removed the picture from the album to examine it more closely. The bicycle was only partially visible, but what she could see matched Brixton's perfectly. The red frame, the silver handlebars, even the reflector on the back wheel. There was no date on the photo, nothing to indicate when it had been taken or who the teenage boy was. She tucked the photo into her bag alongside Brixton's jacket and continued searching the apartment, but found nothing else of interest. The rest of the rooms had been thoroughly cleaned out. Back in her car, she stared at the photo on her phone, zooming in on the bicycle in the background. Was it really Brixton's, or was she seeing what she desperately wanted to see? She needed another pair of eyes, someone who wouldn't be clouded by hope. Across the street, Lakeside Gardens was open, its door propped wide with a large potted plant. Zinnia Moss might be inside right now. Thalia checked the time, 11:30. Falco would arrive soon. She should wait for him. But 15 years of waiting pushed her forward. The nursery smelled of damp soil and flowers. A ceiling fan circulated the humid air, and classical music played softly from hidden speakers. A woman with curly gray hair and soil-stained hands was helping a customer select vegetable seedlings. Thalia pretended to browse until the customer left. Then she approached the counter. "Are you Zinnia Moss?" The woman looked up, her weathered face kind but cautious. "I am. How can I help you?" "My name is Thalia Mercer. I'm looking for information about Cassius Reed." Zinnia's expression immediately shut down, her eyes growing wary. "Why are you asking about Cassius?" "I found something that might connect him to my son, who disappeared 15 years ago." Thalia pulled out her phone and showed Zinnia the photo of Brixton. "His name is Brixton. He was 8 when he vanished." Zinnia studied the photo, her face unreadable. "I'm sorry about your son, truly, but I don't see what Cassius could have to do with it." "I found my son's jacket recently. It had a business card for Merrick's auto repair in the pocket. A flicker of something, recognition, concern, crossed Zinnia's face. "That doesn't mean Cassius was involved in anything. I just found this in his apartment." Thalia showed her the photo with the bicycle in the background. "This looks exactly like my son's bike, the one he was riding when he disappeared." Zinnia studied the photo, her expression tightening. She glanced at the door as if checking for other customers, then turned back to Thalia. "Come with me," she said quietly, gesturing toward a door marked Private. Thalia followed her into a small office crowded with plant catalogs, invoices, and a desk overflowing with paperwork. Zinnia closed the door and leaned against it, arms crossed. "That bike in the photo," Zinnia said. "Cassius found it." Thalia's heart lurched. "Where? When?" "I don't know exactly. Years ago. He found things all the time. Abandoned stuff. Broken things. He'd fix them up." Zinnia sighed. "That's what Cassius does. He saves things other people throw away." "My son wasn't thrown away," Thalia said, her voice cracking. "He disappeared, and I need to know if Cassius had anything to do with it." Zinnia shook her head firmly. "Cassius would never hurt anyone, especially not a child. He's different, yes. People misunderstand him. But he's gentle." "Then why do you seem so defensive? If he just found the bike, why not tell me where he is so I can ask him myself?" Before Zinnia could answer, the office door opened. Detective Falco stood there, his expression grim. "I told you to wait for me, Thalia." "You're early," she retorted, then turned to Zinnia. "This is Detective Zane Falco. He's been working on my son's case since the beginning." Falco showed his badge to Zinnia, whose face had gone pale. "Ms. Moss? We'd like to ask you some questions about Cassius Reed." Zinnia sank into her desk chair. "He didn't do anything wrong." "We're not saying he did," Falco said, his tone gentler than Thalia expected. "But he may have information that could help us understand what happened to Brixton Mercer 15 years ago." Thalia pulled Brixton's jacket from her tote bag. My son was wearing this when he vanished. Somehow it ended up at a thrift store in Westlake. A business card from Merrick's Auto Repair was in the pocket. And now I've found a photo from Cassius's apartment that shows what looks like my son's bicycle, she continued, showing Zinnia the photo again. I need to speak with him, please. Zinnia looked from Thalia to Falco, then down at her soil-stained hands. Cassius doesn't do well with strangers, or with questions. He gets overwhelmed, shuts down. We'll be careful, Falco promised. I've worked with people with special needs before. He's not just special needs, Zinnia said sharply. He has autism, undiagnosed until he was an adult. His parents thought he was just odd, difficult. His uncle Tolan was the only one who gave him a chance, gave him work. She looked at Thalia, her expression softening. I understand you want answers about your son, but storming into Cassius's life with accusations will only make him retreat. I'm not accusing him of anything, Thalia said. I just want to know where he found the bike, and maybe the jacket too. Zinnia was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with her decision. Finally, she sighed. Cassius lives in Millfield now, at Cedar Creek Supportive Living Community. It's a place for adults with developmental disabilities who can live semi-independently. She wrote an address on a post-it note and handed it to Falco. Please, be gentle with him. Thank you, Thalia said, genuine gratitude in her voice. And I'm sorry for barging in like this. There's something you should know before you go see him, Zinnia added. On the drive to Millfield, Falco told Thalia about his brother. His name was Elliot, he said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. 2 years younger than me. We were playing at the creek behind our house. I was supposed to be watching him. Mom had told us 100 times not to go near the water, but he swallowed hard. I got distracted. When I looked up, he was gone. Thalia's heart ached for him. I'm so sorry, Zane. They found his body 2 weeks later, caught in a drainage pipe half a mile downstream. Falco's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. That's why I became a detective. That's why I never gave up on Brixton's case, even when others did. I know what it's like to live with that kind of uncertainty, and with that kind of guilt. It wasn't your fault, Thalia said automatically, the words she'd heard so many times herself, the words that never helped. Maybe not entirely, but I was responsible for watching him. Falco glanced at her. Just like you feel responsible for letting Brixton ride his bike alone that day. The words hit Thalia like a physical blow. In 15 years, no one had ever stated so plainly the guilt she carried. I've spent 15 years wondering if he'd still be here if I'd just said no, if I'd driven him to his friend's house instead. Her voice was barely a whisper. If I'd been a better mother. You were a good mother, Thalia. What happened wasn't your fault. They drove in silence for several minutes, both lost in their private grief. Finally, Thalia asked the question she'd been avoiding. Do you think we'll find him alive, Zane? After all this time? Falco's expression was solemn. I think we need to prepare ourselves for any outcome. But mostly, I think we need answers, whatever they might be. Millfield was smaller than Oakston, a quiet town of modest homes and small businesses. Cedar Creek's supportive living community was on the outskirts, a cluster of small cottages surrounding a central building, all painted a cheerful yellow with green trim. In the parking lot, Thalia suddenly felt unprepared. What would she say to this man who might know what happened to her son? What if he couldn't, or wouldn't, tell her? What if the answers were worse than not knowing? Are you ready? Falco asked gently. Thalia clutched Brixton's jacket, drawing strength from it. I've been ready for 15 years. The community coordinator, a woman named Helen Patel, met them in the main building. She was protective of her residents, asking detailed questions about why they needed to speak with Cassius. Finally, convinced of their sincerity, she agreed to arrange a meeting. I'll speak with him first, she said firmly. If he's uncomfortable, the meeting won't happen. These are his choices to make. 20 minutes later, Helen returned. Cassius has agreed to talk with you, but please understand, he may end the tree conversation at any time if he feels overwhelmed. She led them to a small cottage at the edge of the property. Cottage 7, she said, knocking gently on the door. Cassius, your visitors are here. The door opened slowly to reveal a tall, thin man with graying dark hair cut short in an efficient style. Cassius Reed looked to be in his early 40s, with deep-set eyes that briefly met theirs before focusing on a point somewhere over their shoulders. You can come in, he said, his voice flat but not unfriendly. I've cleared off the chairs. The cottage was small but immaculately organized. What struck Thalia immediately were the shelves lining every wall, filled with carefully arranged collections. Model cars, rocks labeled by type, baseball caps organized by color, and dozens of other categories of items, all meticulously displayed. Thank you for seeing us, Mr. Reed, Detective Falco said, taking the seat Cassius indicated. Most people call me Cassius, he replied, perching on the edge of a straight-backed chair, his hands resting on his knees. Cassius, Thalia said softly. My name is Thalia Mercer. I'm trying to find out what happened to my son, Brixton. She showed him the photo of Brixton. Cassius glanced at it briefly, but didn't take the phone. I don't know any children, he said immediately. I don't talk to children. You don't have to know him, Falco explained gently. We're wondering if you found something that belonged to him. A blue jacket with orange stripes. It had patches on it, a rocket ship, a dinosaur, and a lightning bolt. Cassius's eyes widened, slightly in recognition, and he began rocking almost imperceptibly. I found a jacket like that, he admitted. A long time ago. Thalia's heart raced. Where did you find it, Cassius? By the creek. It was getting ruined in the water, caught on branches. His fingers tapped a steady rhythm on his knees. Things shouldn't be left like that. They get damaged. What creek? Falco asked. Can you remember where exactly? The one that runs between the towns, where the old train tracks used to be. Cassius's rocking increased slightly. I was looking for interesting rocks. I find good specimens there sometimes after heavy rain. Thalia pulled Brixton's jacket from her bag and held it up. Is this the jacket you found? Cassius nodded, his eyes darting to the patches. The rocket ship was coming loose. I fixed the stitching. Thalia examined the rocket patch and noticed that some of the stitches were indeed different, tighter, more precise than her original work. There was a bicycle, too, she said carefully, showing him the photo from the album. In this picture, did you find it at the creek as well? Cassius nodded again. It was broken. The chain was rusted, the front wheel bent. I fixed it. What did you do with the bicycle after you fixed it? Falco asked. I kept it for a while. Then Mr. Hargrove from the community center asked if I had any bikes to donate for their program. Children who needed bikes. Cassius's face showed a flicker of pride. I gave it to them after I fixed it. It was a good bike. Thalia fought back tears. The bicycle Brixton had received for his birthday, the one he had been so proud of, had been donated to another child after Cassius repaired it. "Cassius," she asked, her voice trembling, "when you found the jacket and bicycle, did you see a boy? A child?" Cassius's rocking stopped abruptly. His breathing quickened. "I don't talk to children," he repeated, more firmly this time. "People don't like when I talk to children. They misunderstand." Helen Patel, who had been waiting by the door, stepped forward. "I think that's enough for now. Cassius is getting upset." "Just one more question," Falco said quickly. "Cassius, could you show us where you found the jacket and bicycle? It's very important." Cassius looked to Helen, who nodded encouragingly. "You don't have to if you don't want to, Cassius." "I remember where," he said after a moment. "I could show you. Tomorrow. Not today. Today is my workday at the library." "Tomorrow would be fine," Thalia said, hope surging through her. "Thank you so much, Cassius." As they prepared to leave, Thalia noticed a small shelf near the door that was different from the others. Instead of collections, it held just a few items that seemed more personal. A photo of an older man who must be his Uncle Tolan, a polished rock with a fossil embedded in it, and a small compass with a tarnished brass case. Her breath caught. The compass looked exactly like the one Darian had given Brixton for his 8th birthday, just months before he disappeared. "Cassius," she said, pointing to the shelf. "Where did you get that compass?" Cassius followed her gaze. "I found it. At the creek." The same day, Thalia's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Falco steadied her with a hand on her arm. "Thank you for your help, Cassius," Falco said. "We'll come back tomorrow morning, if that's all right." Outside the cottage, Thalia finally let the tears flow. The jacket, the bike, now his compass. "Zane, what happened to my son at that creek?" "I don't know," Falco said quietly, his hand steady on Thalia's shoulder. "But we're going to find out." Helen had stepped outside with them, giving Thalia a concerned look. "You should know that Cassius has never been in trouble here. He follows every rule, keeps to himself. Our residents are carefully screened." "We're not accusing him of anything," Falco assured her, "but the items he found may help us understand what happened to Thalia's son." They arranged to return the next morning. At 9, Cassius had agreed to take them to the creek where he'd found Brixton's belongings. "Is there a motel nearby?" Thalia asked Helen. The thought of driving back to Pinwick, only to return in the morning, was unbearable. "The Millfield Inn on Main Street is decent," Helen said. "Nothing fancy, but clean." They checked in at the small motel, getting rooms, next to each other. Thalia sat on the edge of the bed, Brixton's jacket spread across her lap, the weight of what they'd learned settling over her. For 15 years, she'd clung to the possibility that Brixton might still be alive somewhere, that he'd been taken, but was safe, that someday he'd find his way back to her. But now, 3 of his personal items had been found at a creek, his jacket in the water, caught on branches. What did that mean for her hope? A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Falco stood there, looking as exhausted as she felt. "We should talk about what we learned today," he said, "and what we might find tomorrow." Thalia nodded, stepping back to let him in. He took the room's only chair, while she sat back on the edge of the bed. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "Cassius?" Falco considered the question carefully. Yes. His reaction seemed genuine. He wasn't defensive or evasive. He kept saying he doesn't talk to children. That could just be his way of telling us he didn't see Brixton, only his belongings. Falco leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Thalia, I need to prepare you for what we might discover tomorrow." You think we'll find evidence that Brixton drowned in that creek? She said flatly. It wasn't a question. It's a possibility we need to consider. The jacket caught in branches in the water. The bicycle nearby. He hesitated. If Brixton was riding near the creek and fell in, then why wasn't his body found? Thalia interrupted, a hint of desperation in her voice. Why didn't anyone see his bicycle? All those search parties, all those volunteers. Someone would have found something. Not necessarily. If the creek runs between towns, it might be in a remote area. And water can carry. He stopped, seeing the pain on her face. I'm sorry. We don't know anything for certain yet. Thalia stared down at the jacket in her lap. I've imagined every possible scenario over the years. Every single one. But until today, they were just my fears, not reality. We still don't know what happened, Falco reminded her gently. But whatever we find tomorrow, we'll face it together. That night, Thalia barely slept. Her dreams were filled with rushing water, with Brixton calling for her, his voice growing fainter as he was swept away. She woke repeatedly, gasping for breath, the motel room closing in around her. By the time dawn broke, she'd given up on sleep and sat by the window, watching the sky lighten, Brixton's jacket clutched to her chest. What would today bring? Answers? Closure? Or just more questions? At 8:30, she met Falco in the motel parking lot. He handed her a cup of coffee from the lobby and studied her face with concern. Rough night? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Whatever happens today, he said, remember that finding the truth matters, even if it's not the truth we've hoped for. They arrived at Cedar Creek to find Cassius already waiting outside his cottage, wearing hiking boots and a light jacket despite the mild morning. He held a small backpack and nodded at them without making eye contact. I'm ready, he said simply. Helen had arranged for a staff member named Marcus to accompany them. Just to make sure Cassius is comfortable, she explained. They followed Cassius's directions, driving about 20 minutes outside of Millfield until they reached an unmarked dirt road. We need to walk from here, Cassius said, getting out of the car. The creek is through those woods. Thalia's legs felt wooden as she followed Cassius down a narrow trail through dense trees. Falco stayed close beside her, while Marcus brought up the rear. The sound of running water grew louder as they walked. After about half a mile, the trees opened to reveal a creek about 15 feet wide, with swift-moving water flowing between steep, muddy banks. In some places, the water looked shallow, revealing rocky beds, but in others, it formed deeper pools. Cassius pointed to a fallen tree that stretched across the water. There, he said. The bicycle was caught against that tree. The jacket was in the water, downstream a little, caught on branches. Thalia stared at the fallen tree, trying to picture what had happened here 15 years ago. Had Brixton been riding too close to the edge? Had he tried to cross the creek and fallen in? That tree looks old, Falco observed. Has it been there a long time? At least 20 years, Cassius confirmed. It fell before I started coming here. I come here to collect rocks and interesting things the water brings. What about the compass? Thalia asked, her voice barely audible above the rushing water. Where did you find that? Cassius pointed to a deeper pool just downstream from the fallen tree. There, in the mud at the edge. The implications hung heavily in the air. Brixton's jacket, bicycle, and compass had all been found in or near the U Creek, at this isolated spot, far from any regular path or road. Where does this creek go? Falco asked. It joins the river about 2 miles downstream, Marcus answered, and that flows into Lake Merrill. Thalia walked to the edge of the water, staring into its depths as if they might reveal her son's fate. The current looked stronger than she'd expected, especially in the deeper sections. If a child had fallen in, there was a bad storm that week, Cassius said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the water. The creek was much higher, much faster. Thalia turned to him. What week? When did you find these things? Cassius frowned, thinking. October. The big storm that flooded the valley. The one where they closed the schools. Falco and Thalia exchanged a glance. Brixton had disappeared in mid-October 15 years ago. There had indeed been a major storm that week. She remembered the search parties struggling through rain-soaked fields, the helicopters grounded until the weather cleared. How did you find the bicycle if the creek was flooded? Falco asked. After the water went down, Cassius explained. I always come after big storms. The water brings new rocks, new things. The bicycle was damaged, mud in the gears, bent wheel. I took it home to fix it. And the jacket? The compass? Thalia pressed. The jacket was in the water still, caught on branches there. He pointed to a cluster of bushes that overhung the water. The compass was in the mud, shiny. I saw it when the sun hit it. Thalia closed her eyes, the reality she'd been avoiding for 15 years finally closing in. Brixton had been here. Somehow, he'd ended up in this creek during or after that terrible storm. His possessions had been scattered, caught, buried, and eventually found by this solitary man who collected broken things. Did you find anything else? She forced herself to ask. Any other items? Or anything else? She couldn't bring herself to be more specific. Cassius shook his head. Just the bicycle, the jacket, and the compass. All on the same day. After the flood. Thalia stared at the rushing water, trying to process what this meant. If Brixton had fallen into the creek during that storm 15 years ago, the current could have easily swept him away. A small boy wouldn't have stood a chance against the force of floodwaters. Detective Falco, Marcus said quietly, this creek has taken lives before. There are warning signs posted at the official access points, but kids still come here to explore. This isn't an official access point, Falco observed, looking around at the unmarked trail they'd followed. No, this is pretty remote. That's probably why. Marcus trailed off, glancing apologetically at Thalia. That's probably why Brixton's body was never found. The unspoken words hung in the air. How did you find this place, Cassius? Falco asked, his voice gentle but probing. I've always explored the woods, Cassius replied. I like quiet places. Places without people. He looked down at his boots, scuffing one against the dirt. I'm good at finding paths others don't see. Thalia walked along the edge of the creek, her mind racing. This secluded spot was miles from Pinewick, far from where anyone had searched for Brixton. How had her 8-year-old son ended up here? Brixton was supposed to be going to his friend Lester's house, she said, half to herself. It was only 3 blocks away. Why would he come all the way out here? Falco joined her, studying the banks of the creek. Kids don't always go where they say they're going, he said carefully, especially if they've found somewhere exciting to explore. But this is miles from home. He couldn't have ridden his bike this far without someone seeing him. Thalia felt the familiar desperate hope rising again. The hope that there was another explanation, that Brixton hadn't simply drowned in a creek no one had thought to search. There's an old railway line, Cassius said unexpectedly. It connects Pinewick to Westlake, passes near here. He pointed through the trees. About a quarter mile that way. The tracks were removed years ago, but the path is still there. Falco looked at him sharply. An abandoned railway line? That would have been a direct route from Pinewick to this area? Cassius nodded. Kids used to ride bikes on it. It's mostly flat, easy to follow. Thalia's breath caught. If Brixton had discovered that old railway path, he might have seen it as an adventure, a secret route to explore. He was always looking for adventures, for new places to discover. "Can you show us?" she asked Cassius. He led them through the woods, away from the creek. After about 10 minutes of walking, they emerged onto what was clearly an old railway bed, level, straight, stretching in both directions through the forest. Though overgrown in places, it would have been an easy path for a bicycle. "This goes all the way to Pinewick?" Falco asked. "Yes," Cassius confirmed, "and to Westlake in the other direction, about 5 miles to each town." 5 miles. A long way for an 8-year-old to ride, but not impossible, especially a boy like Brixton, who loved his new bicycle and was always pushing boundaries. "The day Brixton disappeared," Thalia said slowly, "he told me he was going to Lester's house. But later, we found out Lester was grounded that weekend. His parents weren't expecting Brixton at all." Falco nodded, understanding dawning on his face. "So Brixton may have had other plans all along. Maybe he'd discovered this old railway path and wanted to explore it." "Then the storm came," Thalia continued, her voice breaking. "He might have sought shelter near the creek, gotten too close to the edge." "The banks are steep," Cassius observed, "slippery when wet, easy to fall in." They returned to the creek, which now seemed to Thalia like both an answer and a torment. If Brixton had fallen in during the storm, when the water was higher and faster, he could have been quickly swept miles downstream. By the time the search for him began, any evidence would have been washed away or buried. Falco walked the area methodically, examining the ground, the fallen tree, the spot where the jacket had been caught in branches. Though 15 years had passed, he was still a detective looking for clues. "We need to organize a proper search of this creek and the surrounding area," he finally said, "with a team that knows what they're looking for." "After 15 years?" Thalia asked, doubt in her voice. "Evidence can remain," Falco said gently. "And we've never searched this location before because we didn't know about it." As they prepared to leave, Thalia found herself unable to turn away from the water. This peaceful creek, with its gentle gurgling and dappled sunlight, may have taken her son's life 15 years ago. Had he called out for her as the current pulled him under? Had he been scared? Alone? The thoughts were unbearable. "Thank you for showing us this place," she said to Cassius, who had been standing quietly nearby. "For finding Brixton's things, for taking care of them." Cassius nodded, not meeting her eyes. "Things shouldn't be left broken or lost," he said, simply. "They should be fixed, taken care of." On the drive back to Millfield, Thalia sat in silence, watching the landscape blur past the window. The world looked different now, sharper, colder, more real. For 15 years, she had lived in limbo, simultaneously grieving Brixton and hoping for his return. Now, the hope was fading, replaced by a terrible clarity. "I'll coordinate with the local police," Falco said as they neared Cedar Creek. "Get a search team organized as quickly as possible." "I want to call Darian," Thalia replied. "He should know what we've found." They dropped Cassius and Marcus at the supportive living community, thanking them again for their help. As they pulled away, Thalia watched Cassius walking back to his cottage, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gait precise and measured. This solitary man had unknowingly carried a piece of her son's story for all these years. At the motel, Thalia finally made the call she'd been dreading. Darian answered on the third ring. "Thalia? Is everything okay? Ivy said you went to Oakston." "I'm in Millfield now," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Darian, I think we've found where Brixton's bicycle and jacket ended up. And his compass. The one you gave him for his birthday." A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Where?" "A creek that runs between Pinewick and Westlake. There's an old railway path that leads to it. I think—" She paused, the words sticking in her throat. "I think he may have fallen in during that big storm." The weekend he disappeared. Silence stretched between them, filled with 15 years of shared grief and separate journeys. "I'm coming," Darian finally said. "Text me your location. I'll be there by tonight." Darian arrived at the Millfield Inn just after 9 that evening. Thalia was waiting in the small lobby, Brixton's jacket folded carefully in her lap. When the door opened and her ex-husband stepped inside, she felt an unexpected surge of emotion. They had weathered so much together before grief tore them apart. "Thalia." His voice was rough as he approached, looking older than his 46 years. The 15 years since Brixton's disappearance had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth. She stood, holding the jacket out wordlessly. Darian took it with trembling hands, his fingers tracing the patches lingering on the rocket ship. "It's really his," he whispered. "After all this time." They sat in the empty lobby, heads bent together as Thalia explained everything. Felix wearing the jacket at the mall, the business card from Merrick's Auto Repair, Cassius Reed finding Brixton's belongings at the creek after the storm. "Falco has already contacted the Millfield police," she finished. "They're organizing a search team for tomorrow morning, with cadaver dogs." The last words hung between them, heavy with meaning. They were no longer searching for a missing child, but for remains. The reality they'd both dreaded for 15 years. "I should have been with you for all of this," Darian said, guilt written across his face. "You shouldn't have had to do this alone." "I wasn't alone. Falco's been with me." Thalia hesitated. "Besides, we made our choices a long time ago." After their divorce, Darian had moved 30 miles away, remarried, had 2 daughters who were now 10 and 12. He had built a new life, while Thalia remained frozen in time, waiting for Brixton to come home. "I never stopped looking for him," Darian said, as if reading her thoughts. "I check the age progression photos. I follow every case where an unknown child is found. I've never stopped being his father." "I know," Thalia said softly. "I'm glad you're here now." They met Falco for breakfast at 6 the next morning. He had clearly been up most of the night, coordinating with local authorities. "The Millfield police have assembled a team," he reported. 2 K9 units with cadaver dogs, 4 officers, and a forensic technician. "They'll meet us at the creek at 7. "After 15 years, will they be able to find anything?" Darian asked, the question Thalia couldn't bring herself to voice. "It depends," Falco said. "Water complicates things, but bones can remain for decades, especially if they get buried in sediment or caught in underwater structures." Thalia pushed her untouched coffee away, feeling ill. They were discussing her son's bones with the clinical detachment of people who had already accepted his death. Part of her still resisted, still clung to the small possibility that there was another explanation. "What if we don't find anything?" she asked. Falco met her eyes with compassion. "Then we keep looking. But Thalia, even if we never find physical remains, what we've learned so far gives us a pretty clear picture of what likely happened." The drive to the creek was silent. tension building with each mile. When they arrived, several police vehicles were already parked along the dirt road, and officers in boots and outdoor gear were unloading equipment. Word had spread quickly in Pinewick. As Thalia, Darian, and Falco approached the search team, she was shocked to see familiar faces from her hometown. Dale and Karen Turner, Lester's parents. Jim Walsh, who had coordinated volunteers during the original search for Brixton. Pastor Mike from the First Presbyterian Church. Even Ms. Abernathy, Brixton's second-grade teacher, now in her 70s but determined to help. "They called me last night," Jim explained, embracing Thalia. "Asked if I could round up some of the original search volunteers. Everyone dropped everything to come." Tears stung Thalia's eyes. After 15 years, the community still cared. Still, remembered her son. The Millfield police sergeant, a woman named Rita Hodge, organized everyone into search teams. The cadaver dogs would work the creek and its banks, while human searchers would spread out through the surrounding woods and along the old railway path. "Remember, we're looking for anything that might be connected to an 8-year-old boy who disappeared 15 years ago," Sergeant Hodge instructed. "Clothing, toys, a backpack, or any remains." She glanced at Thalia and Darian apologetically. "Report anything you find, no matter how insignificant it seems. Don't touch or move." Potential evidence. The search began methodically, with teams moving slowly through their assigned areas. Thalia and Darian walked with Falco, following one of the K9 units along the creek banks. The dog, a German shepherd named Max, worked diligently, nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to investigate something before moving on. Hours passed with no significant discoveries. The sun climbed higher, the day growing warm. Searchers called to each other, reporting negative results in their sectors. Thalia's hope began to fade. Perhaps 15 years was too long. Perhaps they would never know for certain what had happened to Brixton. Then, shortly after noon, a shout came from downstream. "We've found something!" Thalia and Darian rushed toward the voice, slipping on the muddy bank in their haste. About half a mile from where Cassius had found the jacket, a volunteer was pointing to something partially buried in silt near the water's edge. It was a small sneaker, caked with mud, but still recognizable. Blue with white stripes. "Size 3. That's Brixton's," Darian said, his voice breaking. "He was wearing those the day he disappeared." Sergeant Hodge radioed for the forensic technician. "No one touch anything," she ordered, creating a perimeter around the discovery. The find energized the search. Teams converged on the area, and the cadaver dogs were brought to work the section of creek more intensively. As the afternoon wore on, more items emerged from the mud and water. The remnants of a child's backpack with a space theme that Thalia immediately identified as Brixton's, a single sock, a plastic toy dinosaur that had been in his pocket. Each discovery was like a physical blow to Thalia, concrete evidence of what she had refused to accept for 15 years. Brixton had been here. He had died here. The creek had kept his secrets, hidden his belongings in its mud and silt, while she waited in vain for him to come home. By late afternoon, the search had yielded no human remains, but the collected items told a clear story. Brixton had somehow ended up at this creek during or after the storm 15 years ago. Whether he had fallen in accidentally or been caught in flash flooding, the result was the same. The current had swept away his possessions, scattering them downstream, and likely carried his body much farther. As darkness approached, and the search was suspended for the day, Thalia stood with Darian at the creek's edge. For the first time, in 15 years, they held hands, united again in their grief. "We should have been searching here all along," Darian said, his voice hollow with regret. "We had no way of knowing," Thalia replied. "No one knew about this place, about the old railway line." As the last light faded from the sky, they made their way back to the cars. Tomorrow the search would continue, but for Thalia, the most important questions had already been answered. Brixton hadn't been taken by a stranger. He hadn't been living another life somewhere. He had died in an accident, alone in the rain, miles from home. The knowledge was devastating and, strangely, freeing. For 15 years, she had lived with countless terrible possibilities. Now, at least, she knew. Thanks for joining me for The Lost Echo. Where are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments below. If this story touched you, please hit the like button to help spread a moment of kindness to others who might need it. If you enjoyed this journey with Thalia and want to hear more stories like this, click on the video appearing on your screen right now. Until next time, take care of each other.